Now we come to the question of free trade, which was a controversial question in the 19th and 20th century and still is a controversial question. And it has become much more controversial after Donald Trump became president of the United States. And then the trade war, the so-called trade war between the United States, China, and the European Union emerged, and also at some other places in the world. So if you talk about free trade, you can easily discuss three theories and then see kind of the questions that are at stake here. So one of the first proponents of free trade was Adam Smith, and he made the case that trade is beneficial, and not only by trading surplus, so you're not only trading stuff that you produce anyway and then want to get rid somewhere else, but also it is beneficial to remodel your own production to produce for other countries and then trade with other countries. And the argument that Smith made there is nowadays called the argument of absolute advantage. And I will just illustrate this with an example. Let's say we have two countries, England and Germany. And both of these countries are good at producing different things. So England is good at producing steel, maybe because they have good steel factories and they have a lot of expertise there. Germany, however, is good in producing wheat, maybe because they have the better soil or whatever. So let's say both countries have a production capacity of 100 units, and for an English company to create steel, it only costs them 5 units, and for creating 1 unit of wheat, it costs them 3 units. In Germany, however, the production costs for steel are much higher because German steel production is not very good, so they need 20 full units to produce 1 unit of steel. But however, because of their good soil, they will be able to produce 1 unit of wheat for only 2 units of production. So let's say they do not trade. What will these societies produce and what will they end up with? Let's start with England. Let's say England produces 11 steel because they are quite good at producing steel and can do this inexpensively, and they will only invest 55 units of production capacity for these 11 units, and they still have 45 units of capacity left to produce 15 wheat. Germany, however, has more difficulties to produce steel because steel production is so difficult there, so they have to invest full 60 units to only produce 3 units of steel. However, producing wheat is so easy in Germany that they only have to invest 40 units and still have 20 units of wheat. And because there's no trade, their own production is what they will end up with. Let's now think of free trade. Under free trade, they can just make different decisions on production. The English can think, well, we are so good at producing steel because our steel production is much cheaper than steel production in Germany. However, we know that the Germans are much better in producing wheat than we are. So the English might decide to invest all their 100 units of production capacities into steel. And then they produce 20 steel. The Germans, they make the opposite calculation. They say, well, producing steel over here, that's such a hassle, we just won't do that anymore. We just focus on what we're good at, which is growing wheat. And so we invest all our capacities into growing wheat, and then they end up with 100 wheat. And now the magic of trade happens. Let's say Germany trades 25 of its wheat for 5 units of the English steel, and then we end up with a situation where England has 15 steel and 25 wheat, and Germany has 5 steel and 25 wheat. So now both countries have more steel and more wheat than they would have before, so everyone's a winner, baby. Now let's look at a slightly different situation. What I did here is leave all the numbers the same as before, but only double the cost of wheat production in Germany. So producing 1 unit of wheat now does not cost 2 units of production capacities, but 4 units. And what you see right now is that England is better at producing steel and also better at producing wheat. So they have the absolute advantage in both things that you could imagine to produce. So if you argue with Adam Smith, you would say there's no point in trading here because what would the English win there? They could only get more expensive wheat or more expensive steel from Germany. They can produce it cheaper at home, so there's no reason for them to trade. And the Germans have to live with it because nobody wants to trade with them if they produce so expensively. However, now David Ricardo steps onto the stage and makes a different calculation, says, well, absolute advantage might be fine, but what we have here is actually still an advantage, but a comparative advantage. What Ricardo adds is the relation of the cost of one commodity and the other commodity in each country. So now you see that producing 1 unit of steel costs the equivalent to producing 1.67 units of wheat in England. And of course, the inverse is also true, that producing 1 unit of wheat in England costs the equivalent of 0.6 units of steel. In Germany, the situation is somewhat different. Here, producing one steel costs the equivalent of producing 5 units of wheat, and producing 1 unit of wheat costs the equivalent of producing 0.2 units of steel. So we have different relations between the cost of the two commodities in each country. And now Ricardo says what we have right here is comparative advantage. Here you can make the same calculations that I made before. I just took the same numbers and the same decisions about production, only that wheat is now more expensive in Germany, so they don't have 20 wheat anymore, they only have 10 wheat. Now let's say they decide to remodel their production for international trade and see what they end up with then. The English would once again model their whole production to steel production and only produce steel, and they would still produce 20 units of steel. Germany would once again only produce wheat, and they would end up producing 25 units of wheat, and both would invest their 100 units of production capacity. Now trade could happen, and the Germans would trade 15 wheat, the English would trade 5 steel, and now we have the English ending up with 15 units of steel and 15 units of wheat. So they have roughly the same amount of wheat that they had before, but they have even more steel left. Germany, however, also has the same amount of wheat, and they still have more steel left. And this is not the perfect calculation, as I realize right now, because you could have also modeled it in a way that both have more of both commodities in the end. The lesson here is that if you think of comparative advantage, even a country that is worse in both, in all commodities, and a country that is better in all commodities, they still have an incentive to trade, and they can gain from trade. So even more than with Adam Smith, with David Ricardo, everyone's really a winner. Now you might ask, who could possibly say something against free trade? And the answer is Friedrich List. Friedrich List's argument basically is, it's all fine what David Ricardo said, his calculations are apt, I don't have any trouble with the math he does right there. What the trouble is that if Germany always produces wheat and England produces steel, then we have a situation in which Germany will always stay an agricultural country, while England will industrialize ever further. So even though free trade might sound like it's something for the mutual benefit, and it even might be so for the very short term, because at the end of the year both have more steel and more wheat, in the long run it will only stabilize the hierarchies in the international political economy, with England advancing ever further and Germany stagnating down here, always relying on British steel. And if you think about it even further, then you can say, well, in the case of military conflict, the British have an industry, and the British probably still have some agriculture. The Germans, however, only have agriculture. Now, just ask the question, with what of the two you can build better weapons? And then you can go on and argue that it is not by coincidence that the proponents of free trade are typically those countries that are economically more advanced. And in the textbook, you find quite a lot of evidence for this when you look at the history of the British Empire. Because at first, when the British rule in India began, the textile industry in Bengal was actually more advanced and more productive than the textile industry in England. And did the English pursue free trade? No, they did not. They safeguarded their own textile industry from international competition. It was only after they industrialized their own textile industry that they then began to engage in free trade, and this free trade then destroyed the Bengal textile industry because now the English products were cheaper. Something that is even worse probably, or arguably, is what we saw in the Opium Wars, is that England proposed free trade with China concerning drugs, concerning opium, and nowadays common sense would always argue, yeah, free trade is probably good and fine, but of course every country has the right to limit the import of heroin or cocaine or anything like that. And this is also the case that the Chinese made there. They weren't against imports from the English. They were against importing opium. So what the British did was forcing the Chinese by military intervention to give up their laws prohibiting opium and force them to legalize opium, basically, in order for the British to be able to export the opium that they produced in their Indian colonies to China, which would then give them a positive trade balance with China in spite of buying a lot of Chinese tea. So you see that although there are good theoretical arguments for free trade, in historical reality, free trade is oftentimes something that is not so mutually beneficial. To be sure, I don't want to make the case that free trade is bad or international trade is bad right here. Trade can really help people on all sides of the globe. It can help some countries develop their productivity. It can help other countries obtaining less expensive products, and it can be very beneficial. However, you should not be naive about it and think there are always only winners. In the economy, there are typically always some winners and some losers, and trade can ideally be fashioned in a way that the losses are minimized and the gains are optimized, but this is not obtained by unlimited free trade typically, because this oftentimes produces losers in a great amount, particularly if you look at it in the long term.